You get up to these CAFOs where you got 80, 90,000 head of hogs or something like that, you're talking about the equivalent waste of big cities. And basically you're outspreading it on the land. You keep all of this dispersed across the land in small independent family farms as we had before. It's kind of like you're saying you live in a rural area, you've got a good functioning septic tank, you've taken care of the environment. But you concentrate 10,000 people in one area, you've got to have a sophisticated waste treatment facility. So what we've done is we've concentrated all the animals, we've concentrated all the waste, but we're treating the waste as if they were all spread out all across the country. I call it agricultural exceptionalism applied to environmental regulations.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without toxic chemicals and synthetic fertilizers. So you just heard from agricultural economist John Ikerd. He explains how externalizing environmental costs and government subsidies have led to large-scale animal confinement in the U.S. food system. John speculates that up to 95% of our meat, milk, and eggs come from mega farms where animals almost never go outside. If you listen to our podcast regularly, you also know that some USDA-certified organic operations are included in those numbers. As he explains, the reason that this happens isn't because large-scale confinement is more efficient than small and medium-scale family farms, quite the opposite. It's actually because so little is made per animal unit that investors can only see a profit if they drastically increase the number of animals overall. John is an agricultural economist and so incredibly knowledgeable on these issues. He's written a number of books, including Small Farms Are Real Farms, Sustainable Capitalism, Revolution of the Middle, and Crisis and Opportunity. If you like what you hear today, I invite you to go back to episodes 28 and 29 of our show when I interviewed him about why industrial food can never be sustainable, no matter how many Band-Aids we try to put over it.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm very pleased to have grabbed John Ikerd at Marble Seat here and have a chance to talk with him. John, welcome.
I appreciate the opportunity. Good. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's great. We started to talk and I thought I got to turn a camera on.
All right.
So let's dive in.
Okay.
You've been working a lot for quite a while on confinement livestock and the perils of it, the problems of it.
Right.
And maybe the solutions to it. But let's talk about what it is and how big an impact it has on our food system right now.
Well, this confinement animal feeding operations, CAFOs is what I refer to them. That's kind of the USDA definition, but USDA would classify something as a CAFO that most people would think about 2,500 head of hogs or 1,000 head of cattle or 700 head of dairy cattle or something like that. But nowadays, that would be, kind of on the smaller side of what the CAFOs are operating out there. Most of them come in at that level because if you get larger than that, then you have to have permits and do various other things. And so that's what we're seeing now that's dominating agriculture. I see different estimates, but anywhere 90-95% of the total meat and milk and eggs come out of a CAFO. I would argue probably at least 70%, but maybe 90-95%. Depend on where your definition is in that. But we've seen that whole transition. It basically started with chickens back in the 30s and 40s, and particularly in the 50s and 60s when they started raising chickens in confinement. Up to then, the chickens had been raised largely in what we would call backyard flocks and that sort of thing, but flocks of chickens were outside, and then they started raising them inside. And then particularly when they started feeding them antibiotics so that they could control disease in the poultry. And then when the poultry came along and that was successful, and we saw that reflected to a certain extent when we saw the beef cattle feedlots, particularly out in the high plains in California and places like that. where the cattle had been fed out on the farms, where you had the cow-calf operation. The cattle would be fed out on the farms, and those would be farms that would have corn or soybeans or whatever that they would feed to the cattle. But they started moving them into the big feedlots. Now, these were outside, but they were still concentrated animal feeding operations, even though they were outside. But they followed kind of on the poultry model of you produce on a larger scale, and then you contract with processors and move it through the system. And everything's a little bit different. But then in the 90s, then it came into hogs. And the thing that had kept it back in hogs, 1970, I remember I got out of graduate school and attended a conference at Purdue University, and they were talking about getting hogs in confinement, but diseases were a big problem in hogs at that time. And they said, we don't know whether we can take hogs indoors because of disease problems. And then they come across more antibiotics went into the hog operations, and then we saw in the 90s the hog operations went from the independent family hog farms into the large confinement animal feeding operations there. And the latest part is the dairy operations. We saw chickens, and then we saw beef, and we saw pork. Now we're in kind of the final stages of the dairy confinements. The independent family dairy farm, like I grew up on, is basically becoming a thing of the past. It's been consolidating for a long time, but now we're going into these 1,000, 10,000 cow herds, milk cow herds. So that's what's happened to agriculture, basically, much of it since the 1950s and 60s.
So, John, I was talking with Mark Schatzker a couple weeks ago, and he told me that the turning point, at least for hogs, was when they started putting vitamins in, and they discovered that without the addition of vitamins, without fortifying that ration, that the hogs got sick unless they went out to the field and ate some alfalfa.
Well, that could probably be part of the transition I was talking about with the health problems. I focused on the antibiotics, which they really started using and made a big difference. But I suspect there were other aspects of that as well. You're talking about vitamins and having to change the requirements. But it's this idea in each one of the cases, they had to go through some process of saying, okay, how do we take the animals out of their natural environment and take them off the land? How do we put them in confinement, whether they're covered or whether they're just in big bare feedlots? And so they had to kind of modify the systems in terms of the nutrition and what they fed them and the management systems and the healthcare and things of that nature to accommodate this industrial model, to try to take these animals that were genetically adapted to being outside animals that roamed and did various things, whether it's chickens or pigs or cattle. And then you bring them into a confined situation, and they're going to be under stresses, and somehow you got to deal with those stresses, and somehow you got to work those problems out. And so that's the reason I think you saw that long-term transition that happened over a long period of time. It took them a while to work out, now how do we take beef in, how do we take pork in, how do we take dairy in, and keep these animals moving through. I think there's one thing that the people that are in the CAFOs, they say, well, these animals are actually more comfortable than they would be if they're outside. They'd say, well, these hogs are in a situation that's climate controlled and things of this nature. But I was just talking to someone who has been working with the slaughterhouse sort of thing, Jim Kleinsmith, and he was taking. I just asked him. He's doing the hide recovery, the other half of beef. Where he's working with people so they can make use of the offal products and things like that. And I asked him. I said, "Are there statistics out here on what part of the livers of these animals that are useful today? It used to be you used to see beef liver, pork liver, and all this stuff." He says the average, and it's in the trade publications, about 70% of the livers today are condemned because of abscesses and growth and that sort of thing. And so that's a reflection of the fact that the livers of these animals are trying to detoxify all of the feeding them these high energy rations that are totally contrary to the normal ration that those animals would eat. And so when they feed that, then these livers are trying to adjust to these high energy diets that are making them grow so fast, and the livers just barely last long enough for them to reach slaughter. And so when they talk about these animals that live under, more comfortable conditions, and they grow so fast and that sort of thing. Basically, what we're doing is we're killing these animals at a very early age, before they get sick enough to die. We're pushing them to the maximum in terms of producing as much as fast as we can. We had dairy cows on our farm, and other people will tell you this thing. We would have cows that would milk 14, 15 years and have calves during that period of time. Now, 2 lactations, or barely 2 lactations, they may even be less than that now, as all the cow goes through, before they're worn out and have to go to the slaughterhouse. They're probably 4 years old, something like that. And they're worn out. You've totally depleted them. Chickens last 10 or 15 years if they run out on the land. I've forgotten what the figure is, but 6 months or 3 months in some cases, if you're talking about broilers, then they go to market. These broilers that you have out here today that are in these confinement operations, they wouldn't be able to walk for a year. I mean, they're growing so fast and they can't get around. So basically what we're doing is we just push these animals so that they produce as much as they can, as fast as we can, and then the animal's health and life is depleted, and we send them to slaughter before they reach the end of their productivity. And then we call that a humane system because the animals are raised inside and don't have to go outdoors. Those animals would much rather be outdoors. I compare it, I say, okay, you want to talk about real health and vigor and that sort of thing. So go to a prison somewhere where they've got a good workout facility and things of that nature, and they've got good diets, good nutritious diets, and you see a lot of really healthy people that have a lot of time to work on building muscles. But is that what you consider to be a desirable quality of life? Being confined in a space where all you can do is eat and build your muscles? Well, that's what we're putting these animals through.
Yeah. So one of the immediate prices for this confinement livestock industry is that the animals not only have, I would think, fairly unhappy lives, but they're quite unhealthy.
Right. It's just that you set up the operation where you can slaughter the animal and realize the value out of it before it gets sick enough to begin to deteriorate. And that's what we're doing, species after species. We're doing that.
And this is somewhere between 70 and 95% of the meat, milk, and eggs produced are coming through this system.
It's probably, depending on what you count, there's some fairly large independent operations that would probably be counted by CAFOs, as some people are not counted by CAFOs as others, and that sort of thing. Probably if you went down to really the pasture-raised products, you're down to less than 10%. You're probably down 4 or 5, 6%.
Right.
And the rest of them are kind of marginal, or they're a CAFO or not a CAFO. Somebody might count it as one, somebody might not.
Yeah. So the reason that this is happening is because it's more profitable to confine them.
Right. And the main reason that it's more profitable is not the advantage in terms of cost of production per head or per pound of pork or per pound of milk or whatever. You may have some advantage of economies of scale, but the people that have done really analysis of the economies of scale and livestock production, it'd be like Iowa State University, Mike Duffy is retired now, but did quite a bit of studies, is you can achieve the economies of scale, most of the economies of scale that are involved in just reducing the cost of production per head or per hundredweight or whatever, at what we would consider to be kind of a modest-sized family operation. It might be some confinement, but not confinement all the time. They have access to the outdoors and something like this, and kind of a modest size. But it would certainly be something less than a CAFO, that 2,500 head or 1,000 head cattle operation. It'd certainly be something less. That you've achieved the main sort of advantages in terms of cost of production per head or per hundredweight, most of it at that point. But beyond that point, when you're moving on out, the kind of economies that they're looking at is what you've done with this industrialized process. You specialize, single species, monocrop, whatever you're talking about, standardize so that you can routinize and mechanize the whole process. And then when you standardize and kind of routinize, then you've simplified the management process so that you can manage and reap the profits from more animals or more acres or whatever it is you're doing. And that's where the real advantage comes from, because as long as the operation is profitable, then if you can produce let's say 5 times as many hogs in a CAFO because you've simplified the management, you've hired people to do all of it, and you've built these different operations, but you're reaping the profit 5 times as many as you can in a pasture-based kind of hog operation where you're selling the product there, then if you can make 1/5 as much profit per head or per hundredweight, then you're making the same amount of total. So if you can make, if you're producing 5 times more and you're only getting half as much profit per head, then you're way ahead in terms of the total profit you're reaping, because you're reaping it from so many more animals or so many more acres. And so that's where the big advantage comes from. And that's what they're doing now, is the integrators, so to speak, are contracting out with several of the CAFO, independent CAFO operators, and then they're taking a share, of the profit on that. But the thing is the profit advantage at the live market level, when you get that to the retail level, is basically something that would be considered almost insignificant. If for example, let's say in the case of hogs, it varies from time to time, but let's say in the case of pork, that only about 20% of what you pay for pork in the grocery store is actually what goes back to the hog producer, regardless of CAFO or whatever, kind of on the average of there. So let's say it costs 50% more per hundredweight to produce in a pasture-based operation or something of this nature, and the rest of the system would work the same as it is now. Then that 50% of that 20%, that's only 10%. So if you didn't add anything else as you go through the processing and distribution, then retail pork prices would be 10% higher. Well, retail pork prices and beef prices went up more than 10% in 2 years when we had COVID. And it's not unusual for price variations like that to be at retail. But if you had to listen to the industry people saying, well, if we didn't have CAFOs, everybody'd starve, or retail prices would go through the ceiling. If you take agriculture in general, it's only about 15% of what we pay at the retail store actually goes back to the production level. So if you took 50% and said, okay, if we go to a more sustainable kind of food system, 50% of that 15%, that's 7.5%, it says grocery prices might be 7.5%, 8 or 10% higher. The problem, it's what's holding up the system now, is there's no efficient way of taking the smaller scale operations, and they don't fit kind of the industrial processing and distribution system. So you've got a tremendously higher cost of processing and distributing the product from the smaller independent farm, and that's the reason they can't sell at a retail price that's 10% higher or something like this. But I'm saying if you change the food system, or if we'd never gone to the industrial system and we had focused on, just continuing to improve the efficiency or whatever of the independent family farming operations and farm in a sustainable way, not specialized, diversified, individualistic, decentralized control and things of this nature, even if it costs 50% more, which it wouldn't if the rest of the system was equally efficient, we'd only be talking about 5-7% higher grocery prices than we'd have right now.
So John, is the government involved in building the system that we have? Is this something our representatives are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a major shift in farm policy that came about in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And if you go back and look at the original kind of farm legislation that came about in the 1930s, the first farm bill was like 1933, I think it was. But that was declared unconstitutional. Well, they came back in 1938, which is the farm kind of legislation that's still there, kind of as the base legislation. And in order the first farm bill was just subsidizing prices for farmers. And they talked about parity prices. You hear parity prices now. It was really parity incomes. the government was saying, okay, we're in the middle of a Great Depression, a large percentage of the population were on farms in rural communities. They said, okay, we need to do something to deal with that. But we also need to make sure that these family farmers who are under tremendous economic stress, that they're able to stay on the farm and take care of the land, provide food security for the nation. And so they said, okay, we're going to guarantee kind of parity incomes, which meant the farm families would have incomes on par with non-farm families in whatever community they were in. So they passed that farm bill, and it went through, and the Supreme Court came back and said that that's just purely an economic sort of thing, and that's the responsibility of the state, it's not the federal government. So they come back basically and they package the same legislation, the same language and everything, but they attached it to the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, which was passed during the Dust Bowl years. And they said, okay, if you combine family farming operations that are good for the economy and good for rural, if you combine that with soil conservation and environmental resources, they said basically the purpose of this is to allow farmers to take good care of the resources for the benefit of the public. And that was the philosophy that drove farm policy to the late 60s, and then they began to modify it. But there was a very prestigious group of university presidents and economists and industry representatives and all that kind of come together called the Council of Economic Development. And they talked about the agricultural problem at that time. And what they said, we've got the new technologies that came out of World War II, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, farm tractors, all this kind of stuff. They said, agriculture is one of the most inefficient sectors of our whole economy. So we've got too many people, too many farmers to make effective use of the new technologies that would make agriculture much more productive. And if agriculture is more and more productive, we could bring down the cost of food. It'd be good for rural communities and the whole thing. It would just need to, and they were saying government programs today are an impediment to increased economic efficiency because we're keeping too many farmers on the land. And they basically said we need a shift in government programs to move farmers off of land into employment in the industry. They'd be better off for the farmers, better off for the communities, better off for society. That's basically the foundation of what they used. The Nixon Butts farm policies of the 70s were based on those same principles. And so every farm policy, every major farm policy since then, we still have conservation programs and various other things, but all the commodity programs and the insurance, crop insurance programs and disaster programs and bailouts whenever you have disease in a CAFO and the government comes in, all of those things has been subsidizing this transition and this industrial model of agriculture based on this idea. And I spent the first 15 years of my 30-year academic career kind of promoting this basic idea that said, okay, if we make agriculture more efficient, eventually we're going to make good food affordable to everybody. It's going to create economic opportunities for farmers that are innovative farmers. The laggards, we didn't worry about them. They would adopt this new technology. Then that's entrepreneurial. That's the American way. So we've got profit opportunities, profitable farmers. It'd be good for rural communities, profitable, economically viable rural communities. It's going to be good for society as a whole. Good, healthy food, good, strong rural communities, good farm profitability. And then we got in the middle of farm financial crisis in the 1980s. That's where it hit me right in the face, that this isn't working. It wasn't good for the farmers. Farmers get big or get out. A lot of the farmers followed our advice, the so-called experts. They got big, they borrowed a lot of money, paid a lot of high prices for equipment and land. Got into the 80s, the export markets dried up. We weren't going to feed the world. It was just a blip in here. Losing your farms, I said, not good for farmers. That's not what I got my education for. And then I began to look at what it was doing to rural communities. It was destroying these rural communities. Rural communities not just about farm productivity and income or economic viability. It's about having people to go to schools and go to church and volunteer in the fire department and be involved in the culture of the community in addition to buying on Main Street and things like that. The rural communities were dying. And then I finally come around and saw what it was doing to the land, the farm fence row to fence row and all that kind of stuff in the 80s. This was kind of, before the beginning, we already had the cattle feedlots then, but before the beginning of the hogs. And I could see, I'd been at Oklahoma State University and worked with the big cattle feeders out in western Oklahoma, and I could see that wasn't a good environment for those animals out there. I just began to realize that an industrial agriculture model, it wasn't good for the land, it wasn't good for farmers, it wasn't good for rural communities. And that's when it wasn't sustainable. I said, you can't continue to do this. We're destroying productivity of the land, we're destroying our rural communities. And then I didn't realize till later what we were doing to the health of the people and the fact that the food, didn't have the nutrient value that it had before. And I went back later and University of Missouri, read some of William Albrecht's work from back in the 40s and 50s. And he said, when we go to producing these crops with N, P, and K, we go to that industrial model, and he says, when we focus on the economic bottom line, he says, we're going to end up with foods that come primarily from what you can get from the air and carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, things of that nature. He says, you're going to end up foods that are high in carbohydrates, but they're going to be lacking in the essential minerals that come from the soil because you're pushing the productivity, and the productivity is going to come from those elements that are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, that have a lot of calories in them. And he says they're going to be lacking in the essential nutrients. He basically was saying if we move in this direction, we're going to end up with a population that's overfed and undernourished because there's too many calories and you're lacking in the things that are essential for, he said, for the essential to develop the kind of proteins that it takes for healthy people. He says we see this in livestock and we see it in people. So, it took me a while to figure out that food system wasn't working for that. And then I began to look into the hunger statistics and food insecurity. And we have more people who are classified as food insecure in the United States today than we had in the late 60s. When CBS did the documentary Hunger in America, they made the best estimate that they could come up with the information available at that time. There was about 5% of the people in the country had been classified as food insecure. I think it's 10 million people out of 200 million. And today, the figures are overall about 11%. The last ones I saw, they vary from year to year. In childhood, children that are living in food insecure homes is always up around 15, 17, highest 20% of the kids in this country living in food insecure homes. So we didn't feed the hungry people. The people that were hungry before are still hungry. You can't solve the hunger problem by making food cheap. So it didn't work on any of those categories. So that's how I got involved in sustainable agriculture, as I call it. And that's the reason I've been involved in it ever since. This industrial agriculture is not good for the land. We're destroying the productivity, the long-run productivity that we have to depend upon. That's what organic farming is about: regenerative, resilient, resourceful kind of use of the land in a way that's sustainable over the long run. You go back and look at the founders of the organic movement. So Albert Howard and other people, they were talking about a permanent agriculture. Sustainable agriculture had to be a permanent agriculture that went on indefinitely. So that's what they were talking about in terms of resilience of the land. And it has to meet the needs of people. Agriculture is the way we meet the nutritional needs of a population, and it has to be good food for people. It has to take care of the land, take care of the people, and the people who are operating it have to make an economic living. But what a lot of people don't realize, and what we've lost track of, and I say this as an economist, the economy is to be a means to a further end. It is not to be the end. The purpose of life is to not grow the economy. The purpose of life was never meant to be making money or accumulate wealth. You make money or accumulate wealth because you want to do something better with that. You want to do something, you want to fulfill your purpose. And the economy is just the means of doing that. And if you've got enough money to do what you need to do with your life, you got all the money you need. If you got to I tell people that are out here on the farms today, and some of the young people saying, boy, we work so hard and we work so long and we got so little money. I say, if you can make enough money on a farm, and farming is what you want to do with your life, you feel that this is your calling, this is the life you want to live. I said, if you can make enough money that you can continue to do that, to do what you think you're here to do, you're more successful than most of the people that live in the cities with two incomes over $100,000 each that can't make ends meet. They can't afford their way of life, As long as you can afford your way of life, you're wealthy. And I think that's what we've got to start looking at. The economy is a means to something. It has to be profitable to be sustainable, but that profitability is to allow you to take care of the land, to be a steward of the land for future generations, to allow you to be a good neighbor, to take care about your community and help build a community and raise families. The economics of the farm is just a means of allowing you to do these things that you really feel you need to do, that you really feel that you ought to do with your life. I think we all have a sense of we're material beings. We need that's things that we buy with economics. We need the food, clothing, shelter, that sort of thing. But all the studies will show it, but our common sense tells us we need relationships with other people. We need to feel good about how we relate to the people around us, our family, our friends, our community. Those relationships are important, and it's not because of what we'll get back in terms of economic returns. We just need that relationship to feel that our lives are meaningful and useful and so on. And we need a sense of purpose and meaning in life. We need to think that it matters what we do and what we don't do. There's a difference between what we ought and ought not to do. And we need those things, and the economy is just a means of allowing us to lead a life that's socially responsible, that's ethical, moral. And that's if you look at industrial agriculture today, I would argue it violates everything except the economic bottom line.
So that's really important what you just said, and it's very clear. When I look back at the evolution or the de-evolution of agriculture in the period you're describing, and you're saying it was failing at providing, health, and it was failing at providing a sustainable landscape. So everybody's losing. Who's winning? Why was it happening?
The biggest mistake we made, and the thing I underestimated most, was the power of the corporation, the power of the for-profit corporation to influence this whole process. They were involved in the Committee for Economic Development that I talked about before. They were involved heavily in that, and they've been involved heavily in policy all the way through. But there's the fundamental difference between a large for-profit organization, publicly traded for-profit corporation, is it's a purely economic entity. That's all it does. Now, the Supreme Court doesn't seem to recognize this, but it says, okay, you've got all these shareholders. All these shareholders have the same kind of ethical values, social values, and things that I talked about before. But they come from all different sectors of this society, but also from different countries around the world, and different religions and different nationalities, different age levels, different backgrounds. The only thing they have in common is the desire to increase the value of that stock. They may be perfectly good and moral people, but a corporation is obligated to serve the common interest of the shareholder. The only common interest in owning shares in a for-profit corporation is to make money, to increase the value of your investment. So it becomes a purely economic entity. Now, an individual farmer has got to make a living, but they're a social person, they're an ethical person. If you've got a family corporation, the family can have shared values. And then they say, we're not just going to maximize profit, we won't do this because it's not right for our neighbors. We won't do this because we don't believe it's ethical. We think we've got a responsibility to take care of the land for future generations. If you've got a closely held corporation, you may have 15, 20 investors that share this common interest. But when you go to the large corporations that basically dominate agriculture today, agri-food system, increasingly even farming, those are economic entities. And the only thing that drives them is this desire to increase the value of the shares. And they're all competing with each other in the stock market in terms of prices. And all the managers have to show a profit. They have to show a competitive rate of return compared to all of their other competitors. And so the people that are in those organizations are pushed toward this profit motive. And anything that restricts that, like government regulations, anything that restricts that is seen as an obstacle. If we can remove that, reduce that, we can make more money. And so they will do everything they can working through the political process to do that. And then the money that's paid in by taxpayers is seen to them as a means of enhancing their profit. If we can get more of what the government takes in, if we can get more of it coming back to us, then we increase profits for our shareholders. And that's what a large publicly corporation does. That's what it does by nature. It's neither good or evil. It's neither moral or immoral. It's amoral. And we need to recognize it as such. And it means, since it has no morals, has no social responsibility, it is the responsibility of us working through government to impose restraints on it, to make it behave socially responsible, to make it ecologically responsible. And that's what you have to do. That's basically what governments are for, is to do that kind of thing. But the thing is when the corporation, what I didn't realize, the corporations have grown so large that their impact on government is so strong. When I went to the University of Missouri and to come from the University of Georgia, that's where I was when the farm financial crisis hit, and that's where I said I can't continue doing this. And I was a head of the Extension Agricultural Economics Department. As soon as I started questioning the industrial system, I wasn't going to become Extension Director or Dean or anything else. My academic, I was plateaued here, So I decided, I went to the University of Missouri. Basically, they wanted a sustainability program. USDA had just put new funds into it and that sort of thing. But they wanted me to say everything they were doing was sustainable. Well, it wasn't. And when I started talking about the fact that what we're doing is not sustainable, we're going to have to change, we need to do programs like this, you wouldn't believe the feedback or the pushback I got through the university system. And it was coming through agribusiness influence, even through the state government, and back through the university. The university was under pressure. I was told at one time we proposed a project called the Brymar Center, based after Harold Brymar, who was a long-term agriculture economist, defender of family farms. We were going to start the Brymar Center was going to evaluate legislation in terms of sustainability. I took that to some of our legislators, and I got called in by the dean and talking to them about it. And they told me, basically, said there's nothing passes through the Missouri legislature unless it's signed off on by the Missouri Farm Bureau and Missouri Ag Industries. That was the lobbyist for the agriculture business. He said, we don't submit anything, we don't propose anything unless those two entities sign off on it. Of course, I didn't have clearance from either one of them. But that tells you the power. Things never get considered unless it passes through the censorship of Missouri Farm Bureau and MOAG Industries. And I suspect the same thing's true in every state. And if if a professor gets out of line somewhere in terms of that, they can expect feedback. In fact, even after I'd been retired for 20 years, the department head, I'm still a professor emeritus, department head, I had some papers online that were critical of CAFOs. It happened to be CAFOs. And they come back and said that we don't think that that's a scholarly paper, we don't think it's whatever, we don't think it's in the interest. And I sent him back the whole idea on academic freedom out of the American Association of University Professors standards. He'd quoted me something, I quoted back to it, and I said, in a public university, even in a private university, the responsibility of the faculty members to the truth and to the public, not to the institution, not to the state. But it's very difficult to be in a situation and to really carry through on that, because you're going to be facing that negative feedback. And that was just at kind of the state level. And then you get at the federal level, then all those people in Washington, politicians, are dealing with that same thing. All of this pressure. And then we allowed unfettered corporate contributions to political campaigns and political candidates. It's just a disaster. That's what I was talking about the Supreme Court didn't understand. I went back and reviewed some of the history of the case rulings on this. And in previous courts where they brought up this thing of corporate personhood, there's been several cases where you'd have dissenting opinions that would come in and say, basically what I've said here. They'd say, okay, when you talk about a corporation being involved in economic activity, then that's fine, what they can do because they are economic entity. But they would say, the Supreme Court judges would say, look, when they're involved in political activities, that's fundamentally different. because political activities are supposed to be about you reflecting your social responsibilities and your ethical values. Sort of the defining ethical values of a nature is encoded in the Constitution. That's where the most solid stuff is. And then the laws kind of reflect the social values. Well, the economic values are totally in conflict with those things. So when you take an economic entity and you give it social or ethical powers, then you basically distorted the whole concept of government. An individual can choose to say, well, I'm going to vote economics all I want to, but when you're putting together all of these people that have these whole divergence of social and ethical values, and you're saying, I'm going to express their economic values, but I can't express their social or ethical values in these decisions. This is just the economic dimension of a person trying to run government. Then that's what's totally wrong about this whole thing. But I didn't anticipate the influence. I said early on, by the year 2020, usually these transitions would last about 50 years when you're going through a major transition. I went back and looked historically. I said by the year 2020, I think it'll be clear that the industrial model of agriculture and food production isn't sustainable, and we'll be headed in an opposite direction. And I still believe that would have been true had it not been for the power of a large corporation. So I've said before that people say, well, you can't change that system. Well, first of all, it's not sustainable. Eventually, it will collapse. I can't say when or where. But that's a question of how long is the government going to prop it up? How long is the government going to continue to allow it to grow? Because right now, it's totally dependent upon the government. If you started enforcing antitrust laws, for example, and break up these corporations like they should be, you'd find that whole processing distribution sector of the food system would be transformed very quickly. You'd move to something totally different. There's a whole concept of market organization. I took a whole course in market organization in graduate school under Harold Breinmeyer, Mission Valley Go. But there's kind of three components in terms of dealing with market concentration monopolies: structure, conduct, and performance. Structure is the number and the size of the firms. And to maintain competition, you've got to have so many firms small enough that no individual firm can significantly affect the total quantity in the market or the price in the market. So that's structure. Conduct is if you've got small firms, they can't collude together because then they begin to act like a big firm. So that's conduct, is you keep them from colluding. And then performance was the end result of that. And in economic theory, in this stable, static world that they always talk about, it would say, once you get monopoly power, you will restrict output and you'll raise prices. So what the courts did is they come back and they said, we're just going to look at performance. As long as we're not seeing prices go up, particularly if we're seeing prices go down, and as long as we got a wide variety of products, which means that there's innovation, then we're not going to pay any attention basically to how many firms there are, how big they are, and we'll only pay attention to collusion if it becomes obvious that they're doing something that just totally preventing anybody from competing with them. That's where you only see the cases nowadays. And so they went away from this. And as I pointed out on many occasions, in order for the invisible hand to work, in order for markets to work like everybody assumes they are working, you have to have a large number of smaller firms to keep the big firms from retaining profits rather than passing them on to the consumers, to keep them from keeping people that have better ideas from getting into the market, having access to consumers. You have to have opportunities for people to enter the market. You have to have good information about products. You can't have all this persuasion and lying and propaganda going out that's brainwashing people. You know, in economics, you assume that the consumer's taste and preferences are pure, as if given by God, they've never been tarnished. Well, we don't have any of those things. We don't have a competitive market. And if we had a competitive market, then you would see these changes that I'm talking about. You would see the desires and preferences of people being reflected through the markets and so on. And if you moved the subsidies that we have on industrial agriculture, the biggest subsidy, while that industrial system is very efficient, it's very risky. You're going out here in large amounts of capital and land, and you've got it in equipment and so on. It's all specialized to go into one commodity or one like the big CAFO operations, all these investments in here. And agriculture is inherently very risky. In livestock, you can have diseases and various other things that can get through it. You can have severe weather of one kind or another that can impact that. And crops, the same thing. So it's a very risky business. So all those government programs I'm talking about, they absorb the risk. We, the taxpayer, absorb the risk of large-scale industrial agriculture. And if we didn't absorb that risk, then they couldn't afford to take the risk that's involved in agriculture. So if we change farm policies,
If government didn't absorb the risk, then the companies
couldn't afford it, the farmers couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
Right now, we have government subsidized crop insurance, which is actually revenue insurance. They've added you can insure the price as well as the yield, which and the taxpayer picks up 60% of the cost of that, plus the cost of administration to the insurance companies. And if you didn't have that, then you couldn't go out and plant thousands of acres of corn or thousands of acres of soybeans or thousands of acres of wheat because it'd be too risky. Your whole crop could get wiped out. Right now, even if you don't have insurance, you still have the disaster payments because the government still comes in if you have a really bad drought or something of that nature. In the state of Iowa, which is probably the easiest place to farm in the world, they have several counties that will be declared disaster counties every year because of floods or cold weather or storms or whatever. So all of that is a way by which we, the taxpayer, are basically propping up the industrial system of agricultural production. And then we don't regulate agricultural production. If you have a CAFO that's got 2,500 head, like I say, kind of at break off of having any sort of regulation at all, you're putting out as much biological waste, potentially toxic biological waste, as a city of 10,000 people. Well, in the city of Fairfield, where I lived before, a town of Fairfield, about 10,000 people, they borrowed and invested $24 million in just an upgrade to the sewer system to meet EPA regulations. Can you imagine if you had anything approaching a municipality waste treatment requirements on a CAFO that's turning out similar waste? You get up to these CAFOs where you got 80, 90,000 head of hogs or something like that, you're talking about the equivalent waste of big cities, and basically you're outspreading it on the land. You keep all of this dispersed across the land in small independent family farms as we had before, it's kind of like you're saying you live in a rural area, you've got a good functioning septic tank, you've taken care of the environment. But you concentrate 10,000 people in one area, you've got to have a sophisticated waste treatment facility. So what we've done is we've concentrated all the animals, we've concentrated all the waste, but we're treating the waste as if they were all spread out all across the country. I call it agricultural exceptionalism applied to environmental regulations.
Yeah. Okay, and it's a great benefit to a very small number of investors.
Absolutely. And
not to the community.
Right. It goes to the benefit of, you see different figures, 10% of the farmers or whatever producers produce 75, 80% of the output and things of that nature, And so that's, you look at the proportion of production and then you're looking at the proportion of waste, but also more than that, it's all concentrated waste. It's all concentrated in one place. And so the benefits just go to those people who are largely accountable for the waste that's associated with agriculture.
So let me ask a question. I've been hearing a lot from people about the Green Revolution. Have you studied that?
Oh, a little bit, but I'm not an expert on it. But the Green Revolution is basically saying if you're talking about the Green Revolution that we've had before, we're talking about basically industrializing agriculture, going into other countries around the world and industrializing your agriculture. And so you do have the same consequences that you'll have here. When I was at the University of Missouri, I'd have people, kind of international visitors that would come by occasionally, and some of these people were interested in sustainability. They'd read something that I'd written or something, so they'd want to talk to me. So they didn't bring people around normally to talk to me at the University of Missouri, but if these people asked to, they'd bring them in. And so I would talk to them, and they would say, okay, this is what we've been told, and this is what they're promoting. And I said, okay, they told you that you could increase productivity and you were going to have bigger farms and be more efficient and that sort of thing. But I would say, did they tell you this is what's going to happen to your communities? Did they tell you that that these farming operations are going to be consolidated in bigger and bigger operations, and your people now that are making a living on a farm are not going to be able to make a living on the farm. And when they're not able to stay there, then they're going to have to be forced into the cities where there's no job for them. And so the rural communities that they left are going to dry up and die. And then you're going to have these slums in the outside of the cities. And they're going to go in, they're going to destroy the environment, they're going to pollute your water, they're going to pollute your air. Did they tell you they're going to do that? And I would say, you know how I know it's going to happen? Because that's exactly what happened here. And it's going to happen there. Jimmy Carter at one time, I've always been a big fan of Jimmy Carter, and I still send a little money to the Carter Center every now and then. But anyway, he participated in something, christening, it was some sort of program that was kind of like at the Monsanto Center at one time, and I wrote him a letter. He would write in the margin and send it back to me. But anyway, he was proposing something one time with Borlaug, you know, kind of the father of the Green Revolution. He was going to work with him, you know, to try to develop agriculture in some of these low-income countries, you know, to try to help the people. And so I wrote him a letter. I wrote Jimmy Carter a letter. And I said, look, you grew up on a farm. You know what's going on in agriculture. I said, look, if you support this program in other countries, that's exactly what's going to happen to the agriculture in these countries. And he wrote back and said, well, he says he'd been listening to the experts or something of that nature, but he never implemented that program. So that's kind of what feedback I get from Vandana Shiva and a lot of people that have been involved in these things. I have no reason to doubt what they're saying at all, those that have experienced it directly, because that's the inevitable consequences when you specialize, standardize, consolidate, control. It ends up with exploitation, extraction of the natural resources of rural communities and of the human resources of rural communities.
Let me ask you a question. Somebody said in an interview that they had read that Borlaug was responsible for saving 1 billion people from starvation.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about where the figures come from, but they're probably just looking at saying, okay, we have certain increases in a certain amount of production. We had so many more calories produced than we had before and this sort of thing. And then another thing that they talk about is in countries where they have economic development, they say, well, people have $2 a day rather than $1 a day or whatever. And then they use that as a count of poverty. But I'm not sure where the figures come up on doing that. But basically, that's kind of the assumption that they couldn't have or wouldn't have increased productivity of agriculture and produce more food by any other means. And I don't think that's a logical assumption at all. We still have, what people talk about, they argue about what proportion of the people in the U.S., in the world, are fed on small farms. And when they talk about a picture, they talk more and more about 35%. But what they don't look at the details, that 35%, they're talking about less than 5 hectares, less than 10 acres. That's what's feeding this. If you go up to what we call small farms in this country, you're talking about 75, 80% of the people in the world are fed on those operations. So they're not being fed out of the industrial farms. They're not being fed out of the Borlaug farms right now. So I don't know what billion people he's counting on, but the statistics show that the majority of the people in the world, the vast majority of them, are not fed in those kind of operations. So I suspect what they're simply doing is they're calculating, okay, the increase in calorie consumption, increases in yields and that sort of thing, and how many people would have been fed with how much increase in calories as a result of the Green Revolution. And as we know in the United States, just increasing the amount of calories that you produce does not mean that you're eliminating hunger. You may be creating, in fact, obesity and those kind of related diseases, diabetes and heart disease and heart trouble and things like that. That's now called another form of food insecurity. We got food insecurity because of lack of calories, and we got food insecurity because of lack of nutrition. And the lack of nutrition now is gaining on lack of calories in terms of being a global problem. And that's associated with the industrial food system. That's directly. I came across some USDA statistics that had like 100 years of consumption, consumers' consumption of calories, and went through the whole year period. So as in the early part of the 1900s, as people were working less because they were, fewer labor jobs, fewer people on farms and all that sort of stuff that were really hard labor, we had a decrease in the per capita calorie consumption up till about 1960s, 1970s. 1960s and 70s, it kind of leveled out. After that, we had a major increase going on through the rest of the century. Okay, what happened in the second half of the century? We weren't working harder. We weren't consuming more calories. We industrialized the food system. Now, since 2000, there's been a lot more attention to diet and obesity and that sort of thing. It's kind of leveled out, but we just had a dramatic increase. And we still have major problems with, lack of, I started talking about nutritional food security, not just food security, nutritional security. And that's what we need to start focusing on. Changing how we produce our food and the nutrient value of our food is as important as the calories. And what we're doing now isn't working. What we're doing now isn't working for food security. Our government programs aren't working for food security, just simply giving people money to spend and then leaving them vulnerable to the industrial food system to limit the kind of choices they have and convince them to buy convenient food and junk food. That's that deception I talked about where markets don't work right when you deceive consumers. That's not the solution to the problem. I work with a person called Doria Robinson. I've been on programs a couple of times out in Richmond, California. Who works with low-income people. She involves the whole community. They've taken the abandoned rail line and turned it into orchards and gardens and produce their own food and CSAs and all this kind of stuff. But I quote her a lot, and she says, people are hungry simply because we don't care enough to change the way we do things. That's true now. We want everything to be done by buying and selling. We want it to, we have this impersonal thing. If we just simply give people money, that solves the problem. If we simply allocate money to hunger, that'll solve the problem. It won't. That is the problem. Depending on money to do things that can only be done out of personal relationships and a sense of ethics and moral, depending on money, money doesn't reflect those things. Money's always this impersonal thing. It's not designed to meet human needs for relationships and ethics and purpose and those kind of things. And as long as we don't care enough to change the way we do things, to move away from just paying to solve this problem until getting involved in solving it within our local communities, we're going to continue to have that problem.
John, as we come to a close, when we were talking over there, you steadfastly insisted on hope and that we are going to move this in the right direction.
Right. And we're going to, first of all, because I said before, it's not sustainable. Sustainable is not just a buzzword. It says, can you keep doing what you're doing? And so all these definitions of sustainability, you can throw them around, do whatever you want to with them. But we as a society, we understand what sustainability actually means because we understand what's not sustainable. When I first started working on sustainable agriculture, sustainability was just a rare word. Most people, might have heard it once in a while, but now it's just common terminology. That's not sustainable. That's not sustainable. That's not sustainable. We can't do that. That's not sustainable. That was the purpose, really, of the sustainability movement, is say, what we can't continue doing what we're doing now indefinitely. It's not sustainable. So I don't care what you call what we change it to. You can call it regenerative, organic, resilient, resourceful, whatever name you give it, as long as we can continue doing it, as long as it's a permanent system, like Sir Albert Howard talked about and the others. That's what sustainability is about. So what we're doing now is not sustainable. But the other point is, in terms of what gives me hope, is we've got increasing public awareness of the problems that we're talking about here. There's increasing public awareness of the downside of CAFOs. You can go online and you can Google any major newspaper and you can Google CAFO factory farms, whatever, and you'll find a whole range of stories. You find more books now that are written. Just a book just come out called Barons. It's about the barons in 7 different sectors of agriculture that basically control it. But there's an increasing public awareness. And if you increase public awareness that there's something wrong, the industry The corporations are going to try to convince everybody everything's just fine. You've got to live in the greatest country in the world, the highest income level, the greatest luxuries, and all this kind of stuff. They try to convince you everything's just fine, but there's an increasing awareness that it isn't just fine. I think that's part of the dissension in society, dissatisfaction with government, dissatisfaction with life. Economy's doing great, but everybody's pessimistic. There's this awareness that what we're doing isn't working. It isn't going to work. We don't know what to do instead of that yet, but that's the first phase of it. I say you have to have three things in place for have big changes. You have to conclude that what we're doing now isn't working. It isn't going to work in the future. The second is you have to have an idea of what you're going to change to. You have to have an image. That's what this conference is about. That's what this Real Organic is about. That's what the environmental movement's about. That's what the social justice movement is about. All those things are saying, okay, here's what we need to move to. We're creating, people at this conference and elsewhere, they're creating the agriculture of the future. I don't know which one of all these ideas is going to be the most prominent or whatever, but that's what's happening. So we need that vision that there's an alternative we can shift to if we shift away from the industrial model. And then the third thing is we have to believe that it's possible. And that's where we've still got to convince people. There's people that are really skeptical saying it's not possible. And that's where I come back to the government policies. If we had a fundamental shift in government policies, let's just talk about agriculture, but if all straight across the board, if we started enforcing antitrust in agriculture and things of that nature, we'd change that part of it. If we quit subsidizing industrial agriculture and started absorbing the risk of people in this conference and things like that, it takes a long time to transition from a conventional kind of farming operation, even if you're a new farmer, to really getting a sustainable, organic, regenerative going. We ought to be using government programs to absorb the risk of that transition rather than continue to subsidize these corporate operations. So if we could start that process of absorbing the risk of people that want to transition to a more sustainable agriculture system and quit subsidizing the industrial system, that system would change in a decade. And if we started enforcing antitrust and we took corporate money out of politics, then we could begin to do that at the broader economic level. And so I think the things are beginning to fall into place. And I have hope, that the people are awakening, and ultimately you change public opinion. That's the only thing where you can get a permanent change in public policies, if you change public's opinion to support the change in policies. If we had a change in policy, we are further along today in terms of developing the agriculture system of the future, the sustainable agriculture system, than we were in developing the industrial agriculture system back in the 60s and 70s when we had the change in policy that brought that about. We know more about how to grow food, sustainably healthy food within local communities by local farmers. We know more about how to do that today than we knew about how do you run an industrial hog operation or how do you run an industrial cropping system in the 1950s and 60s when we made that transition. If we made the transition in policies to support the people that really know how to do something different, then we could have a change in a hurry. And then the other thing is when I talk about hope, people ask me, I'm optimistic. I say, well, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And hope means that you know that something is possible. And that's the one reason I keep coming to conferences like this as long as I can, because it reaffirms in me, when I see particularly all the young people here, you see all these people and you see how enthusiastic they are. And I sat in on some sessions where they're young families and they were talking about, it's hard work and that sort of thing, but we're raising the families and, they're raising the kids as a part of farming. That's what it was when I was growing. Then I'm hopeful. I see these bright young people that could be doing anything that say, we want to farm. And they understand it when I say, if you're making enough money to farm and that's what you want to do with your life, you're making enough money. Just quit worrying about having some. And I've also said that the biggest change in farm policy that we could have that would really encourage sustainable agriculture is if we had universal medical care for everybody, so you wouldn't have to worry about working off the farm to get health care insurance. And the other thing, 2-year free education, so you wouldn't have to worry about sending the kids to college so that they could participate in society. So those things are fairly simple. You could, we're moving in that direction anyway. Yeah. So that these are all reasons to be hopeful. And so it's particularly, if I went out and speak at a conference like this or attended somewhere and it was all old people like me, then I'd probably get very depressed. But when I see all these young people that are enthusiastic, they could be doing anything, they could be earning twice as much money, maybe more, and they say we want to be farmers. I tell people, you shouldn't farm unless that you feel that's why you're put here on earth. If you feel that God put you here to be a farmer, then I think you can find a way to do it. But I see all these people that want to farm and they want to have a chance to farm, and we need to make it easier for them rather than more difficult, and there's no reason we couldn't and shouldn't do that. So I remain hopeful going into the future.
All right, John. John Ikerd, thank you so much, and I so respect your work. I'm
Thank you.
so glad that you're here,
Yeah.
still coming to these conferences
Yeah.
and teaching people and sharing your ideas. So,
Well, I'm always glad to have an opportunity to share my ideas for whatever they're worth. If people don't think they're worth anything, they don't have to listen to me,
that's
right?
right. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.